I wore an innocence like a mask, and it fit so well that even I sometimes forget what lay beneath. I watched the couple in front of me, two people locked in silence, each avoiding the other's eyes like they'd turned to glass. They came to me over a betrayal. Classic signs of it were everywhere: crossed arms, clipped answers, a gap wide enough to swallow them both whole. "So," I said, glancing between them, "what would it take for you to forgive a betrayal?" The husband shifted, eyes dropping to the floor as if he'd find the answer in the grain of the carpet. His silence told me more than any answer could. I knew what I was supposed to feel: professional detachment, objective empathy, but each of my questions cut deeper than it should have. Mara's name lurked in the back of my mind, shadowing every line I spoke. My wife. My marriage. "What would it take for you to believe her?" I imagined someone asking me. I'd scoff, probably. Trust. It's supposed to be given, right? Not proven. But in my field, every word, every pause, every sideways look is part of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The husband muttered an answer, but I barely heard him. My thoughts wandered back to Mara. If she were my client, I'd know exactly which questions to ask. But in marriage, a therapist's skills are a liability, and that was the unsettling truth crawling under my skin. After the session, I slumped back in my chair, running through Mara's recent behavior in my mind. She'd been different lately. Later nights, stories about work friends she'd never mentioned before. Her laughter had a new ring to it, a little louder, almost strained, as if she had something to hide. Or someone. If it were a stranger sitting across from me, I'd pick it apart. But this wasn't some stranger. It was Mara. I leaned forward, telling myself I'd let it go, move on. But the patterns I'd seen in others were right there in front of me, glaring and obvious. Ignoring them would have been lying to myself. And I never lie to myself. Mara was waiting in the kitchen when I got home, sipping a glass of red wine, her face calm and unguarded. I watched her for a moment before I stepped forward, choosing my words with care. "How was work?" I asked, slipping into a seat across from her. She looked up, giving me that small, practiced smile I'd seen 100 times before. "Good, busy," she said, taking another sip. "I went out with some friends from the office afterward." "Friends?" I asked, watching her closely. She shrugged, her tone too light. "I told you about them last week." Something about the way she said it, so smooth, so certain, felt like sandpaper across my nerves. I nodded, keeping my voice even. "You've been out quite a bit lately. Must be nice, having friends you're close with." She laughed, a quick, controlled sound. "Aaron, you're overanalyzing again. Not everything needs to be picked apart." I kept my expression neutral, but a flicker of resentment coiled in my gut. Her easy deflection, meant to disarm, only deepened my suspicions. She'd learned to mask her tells, as if she'd studied them. And as she turned away, I realized she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next day, I met Lisa Greer for lunch. She was easy company, warm, empathetic, everything Mara had once been. We settled into a corner booth, and the words spilled out before I could stop them. "I think Mara might be hiding something from me," I said, watching Lisa's expression shift from curiosity to worry. She leaned forward, brow furrowed. "Aaron, are you sure? I mean, it's Mara." "I know," I said, shrugging. "It just doesn't add up." Lisa's gaze softened, but then she hesitated. "You know, she mentioned seeing one of your patients a while back. Patient X, I think." Her words hit me like a slap. "She mentioned him?" Lisa's face scrunched up, suddenly hesitant. "I just assumed you knew. She ran into him somewhere, I think. Maybe she just, I don't know, felt sorry for him?" The details sat heavy in my mind. Patient X, a dangerous, manipulative type, the kind that saw people as pieces in a game. My mind raced, and for the first time, I felt something colder than suspicion creep in. A connection between Mara and him? It wasn't just disturbing, it was explosive. Patient X wasn't like other patients. He was charming in a way that bordered on unsettling, with a kind of dark allure that made him easy to underestimate until it was too late. The stories he'd shared in my sessions, the ruthless, calculated actions he'd justified in the name of control, they weren't just red flags. They were warning sirens. And I'd seen how he operated, how he had turned people's lives into his own twisted playground. But Mara? The thought of him and Mara in the same orbit twisted my stomach. Was she being manipulated by him? Or worse, working with him? A new image filled my mind, one that left no room for doubt. If he had wormed his way into Mara's life, then whatever was going on was deliberate. And if she was involved, the betrayal wasn't accidental, it was planned. Back at my office, I pulled out patient X's file, sifting through his words with fresh eyes. There, hidden between lines that once felt routine, were phrases that took on a new weight. He'd mentioned new allies and plans. I'd written them off as talk, but now, each word felt like a clue, taunting me. I tried to think back, piecing together conversations. Had I missed something? Did I ignore the signs because I wanted to believe Mara was untouchable, that whatever we had was stronger than my worst clients? But this was no typical betrayal. This was something darker, and the realization twisted inside me, shifting from suspicion to certainty. I wasn't dealing with simple infidelity. This was calculated, targeted. That night, Mara sat reading on the couch when I got home. I watched her for a moment, my mind racing, before I dropped onto the chair across from her. "I ran into Lisa today," I said, keeping my tone casual. "She mentioned you've crossed paths with one of my patients." Patient X. Her smile held steady, but a flicker of something crossed her face. There and gone. "Oh, him," she said too lightly. Lisa always jumps to conclusions. The smile, the dismissive tone, she was trying too hard. She closed her book, leaned back, her eyes holding mine with a touch of challenge. "Honestly, Aaron, maybe it's time you stopped analyzing everything. Not everything is about you and your patients." She rose, turning away, her casual dismissal lingering in the air like a taunt. But her words only solidified my resolve. She thought she'd outplayed me, thought she could turn the tables. She was wrong. I stayed up late that night, pacing the office, piecing together a plan. If Mara and Patient X thought I was an easy target, they'd made a fatal miscalculation. Whatever secrets they thought they could keep, I'd drag them out one by one. This was my life, and I had no intention of letting them tear it apart. The phone sat there on the counter, silent and unassuming. Mara had left it in her usual rush, a small slip in her otherwise careful routine. I watched the door click shut behind her, counted to 10, and finally, with a shaky exhale, moved toward the device that now held the answers I dreaded to uncover. My fingers worked fast. Within seconds, I downloaded a tracking app, set it to monitor her messages, her calls, her location, anything that could give me the truth she'd hidden away. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but after weeks of hollow reassurances, all layered over 2 smooth smiles and clipped goodbyes, I needed proof. The app buzzed quietly, unassuming as it marked the map, and each location pinged on my screen like a nail in the coffin. She'd be gone for hours under the pretense of work, but every route was a trail that wandered to places I knew weren't part of her job. The lies were becoming almost blatant, as if she'd started to believe I wouldn't notice. "Another late meeting tonight?" I asked over breakfast one morning, my tone casual. She didn't look up from her coffee. "Yes, I told you, we're working through a client rebrand. It's been long hours." I forced a nod, though the words tasted bitter. Mara wasn't the kind to make rookie mistakes like this, to be so careless, unless she was confident I'd never look. And maybe I wouldn't have, had it not been for him. Patient X, a cafe just off 2nd Avenue. The app confirmed she'd been here 3 times in a week. I knew the place. I'd sent Patient X to his own share of similar spots. Public, familiar, places that felt private but still offered an escape. He was a master of manipulation, slick and polished on the surface, hiding a remorseless undercurrent. That morning I made sure I arrived before them, choosing a table in the back corner, one where I could watch unnoticed. Then, on cue, they entered. Mara with her usual grace and a man trailing behind her. A man I knew better than I'd ever wanted to. Patient X. Or Gabriel, as he called himself out here. I felt the familiar twist in my stomach as I watched them settle into a table across the room. She was talking, hands gesturing slightly, but the smile was his. Gabriel's trademark, that cold, calculating smile I'd seen too many times. He leaned back, clearly in his element, and I clenched my jaw, hating how relaxed he looked, as if this were all a twisted game. I let a few minutes pass, then finally stood, keeping my movements slow as I approached their table. Mara looked up first, a flicker of surprise quickly masked. Gabriel followed, raising an eyebrow, his smile widening. Aaron, Mara's tone was light, a bit too light. What a surprise. Gabriel simply watched, his face unreadable, almost amused. Nice to see you too, Mara, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on her. Then I nodded, almost reluctantly, in his direction. Gabriel, he held out a hand, the same one that had helped dismantle so many lives. I forced myself to shake it. Dr. Black, he said, his tone laced with a slight challenge. I felt the weight of his gaze, the small twist of his mouth like he was savoring every second. What brings you two here? I asked, letting my gaze shift between them, as if trying to fit two halves of an incomplete puzzle. Mara's face remained calm, unbothered. Gabriel is a client contact from work, she said, a bit too smoothly. We're going over some campaign details. Ah, I said, holding back a smile. Campaign details. You always did have an eye for the persuasive. She laughed, the sound forced, though her eyes held steady. Aaron, not everything's a case to be solved, you know. I caught the flash in her eyes, a warning. And yet, I said, looking over at Gabriel, sometimes people surprise us. I tilted my head, letting my words hang, studying Gabriel's expression for any slip. I don't recall hearing about a Gabriel in your recent stories about work, Mara. Really? She said, her voice level. I'm sure I mentioned him. Gabriel's smile widened, like he was enjoying a private joke. I must have slipped through the cracks, he added, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. He leaned back, crossing his arms as his gaze flickered between us. I said, shifting my weight. I'm usually good at remembering names. But maybe you're right, Gabriel. Some things do tend to slip through. Mara glanced at her watch, her fingers drumming the table. Well, Aaron, it was nice seeing you. We wouldn't want to keep you from... Oh, I don't mind staying, I said, cutting her off, letting a slight edge creep into my voice. I could use a coffee. I nodded at Gabriel. I'd hate to think I'm interrupting anything. Gabriel chuckled, his smile all teeth. Dr. Black, he said smoothly, you don't strike me as a man who believes in interruptions. He let the words hang, the challenge in his tone unmistakable. Depends on what I'm interrupting, I replied, letting my gaze settle on him, unblinking. Everyone has something worth protecting. Do they? He said, the edge of amusement still in his voice. His gaze didn't waver. Or maybe some things aren't worth as much as we think. I forced a polite smile, though the resentment burned just beneath the surface. Maybe you're right. But then again, some things are worth seeing through. Mara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between us. Aaron, really, she said, feigning a laugh. You're overanalyzing again. This is just work. Of course, I said, letting a hint of skepticism slip through. I wouldn't want to misread things. I straightened up, the weight of Gabriel's gaze still on me, like he was testing me. But I kept my expression neutral, nodded with restrained politeness, and offered a final look to Mara. Enjoy your meeting, I said, letting the words linger. I'll see you at home. As I turned to leave, Gabriel's gaze clung to me, a quiet satisfaction radiating from him, as though he was certain he'd rattled me. But he was wrong. He was only stoking the fire in my resolve. That evening, back in my office, I went over every detail. Mara's calm, the way she brushed off my questions, none of it was accidental. And Gabriel's presence there, he was always steps ahead, never caught off guard. That was his game. A man like him didn't stumble into these situations by chance. And yet, was it possible I'd been imagining connections that weren't there? Misreading patterns that were simply products of my own paranoia? By the time I walked into our next session, my mind was a tangle of doubts and certainties. But Gabriel didn't miss a beat. He settled into his seat with that same smug air, the arrogance of someone holding all the cards. Trust, he began, crossing one ankle over his knee as he looked me over. Funny thing, don't you think, Doctor? People tend to give it so freely, until they're backed into a corner. I felt the words land like a slap, aimed directly at me. Trust is something I've learned to reserve for those who earn it, I replied, keeping my tone even. Ah, he said, a slow smile creeping across his face. But the closest ones can surprise us the most, don't you think? The thinly veiled insult set every nerve on edge, his words a calculated jab. I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure he took in the sting of each word. The message was clear. He knew exactly what he was doing, and worse, he wanted me to know it. As he stood to leave, he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's often the ones you least expect. It took every ounce of restraint to keep my expression steady, to not give him the reaction he was baiting for. But the second he was out the door, I felt the full weight of his words settle in. He knew, or at the very least, he suspected that I was on to him and Mara. The game wasn't just beginning, it was already halfway through. After that, I went to Lisa. She'd always been the voice of reason, the one person I could rely on to bring me back to center. But that afternoon, as I shared my doubts, her words echoed like a threat. "You're creating something that isn't there, Aaron," she said, her tone warm and gentle. "Sometimes it's easy to see patterns where there aren't any." The words had a cold familiarity to them, the same language Mara used whenever I probed too closely. "Don't overanalyze, Aaron," she'd say, a convenient dismissal that now sounded too perfect. "Maybe," I muttered, forcing a smile, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Lisa's reassurances, once a comfort, now only added to my doubts. A few days later, I heard Lisa on a call from the break room, her voice light as she mentioned Mara by name. The casual tone sent a chill down my spine. How close were they, really? Was Lisa simply a confidant, or had she known more all along? I walked back to my office, each step heavy with the realization that this wasn't just about Mara or Gabriel. I was surrounded by a circle of deception. That night, I reviewed every detail, turning over possibilities I hadn't considered. If Gabriel had wormed his way into Mara's life, and if Lisa knew more than she let on, this wasn't a simple case of infidelity. It was deliberate, calculated, a betrayal designed to fracture me from the inside out. As I closed my laptop, I made a decision. No more waiting, no more guessing. This was my life they'd tangled up in their games, and I'd be damned if I'd let them destroy it without a fight. The app's notifications came in bursts, short, taunting chimes that lit up my screen late at night, usually as Mara sent some last-minute text or tapped out a message from her laptop. My patience was shredded, the edges of rationality dulling as I sat there, night after night, reading fragments of her conversations. But it wasn't enough. Whatever I'd captured so far barely scratched the surface. So I did what I'd promised myself I wouldn't. I installed new software, something more invasive. This one would feed me copies of everything: files, messages, even drafts. Each step felt like crossing another line, deeper into the invasive muck of my own suspicion. But it was all I had to fight back with, so I silenced any guilt that tried to claw its way in. It was almost a routine now. I'd come home, lock myself in my study, and sift through her digital traces. Even harmless messages, things like picking up groceries or leaving work, carried a weight they hadn't before. I started seeing hidden meanings, clues I'd missed in the past, subtle lapses that suddenly felt deliberate. Every laugh, every word from her mouth became potential evidence. My clients were beginning to notice the change. One afternoon, during a session with a couple in the middle of a heated argument, the husband paused, a half smile crossing his face. "You look like you're the one who's got problems today, Doc," he said, a jab hidden in his tone. I brushed it off, tried to refocus, but the words hung in the air, echoing louder than the argument in front of me. That nagging realization crept in, the one I'd been avoiding. I was slipping, and everyone could see it, even my patients. The confrontation came later that night. Mara was in the living room, curled up with a book. I didn't want to believe she could carry on so calmly, knowing what she was doing to us. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, wrestling with the anger that had built to a point I couldn't ignore. "So," I said finally, my voice strained, "are you going to tell me where you really go every night?" She looked up, and for a second, her face was blank. Then, a slow, practiced smile crept across her lips. "We've been over this, Aaron. It's work." Work? Out of the office in random parts of town? For hours on end? My voice rose, the disbelief spilling over. She didn't flinch, only closed her book and fixed me with a look that could have been pity or indifference. "Aaron, you're losing it. Maybe you should spend more time working on yourself instead of analyzing everything I do." Her tone was cold, detached, like I was just another one of my own patients grasping at threads. "You think I don't know?" I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "You think I can't see what's going on?" Her gaze hardened, turning accusatory. "Oh, please, Aaron. Maybe all those miserable couples you counsel are getting to you. It's warped your view of the world. You think everyone's hiding something." Her words struck like a slap, and I faltered, caught between anger and the gnawing fear she might be right. Had my work changed me that much? Was this obsession a product of seeing too many broken relationships, of picking apart the lies for so long that I'd started seeing them everywhere? "You can twist this all you want," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I know something's going on." She shrugged, unfazed. "Maybe you're the one with the problem, Aaron. Maybe it's time you took a break from fixing everyone else's life and looked at your own." Her poise, the way she coolly deflected every accusation, felt like a final betrayal. And as she turned back to her book, I felt myself unraveling, the ground beneath me slipping. Hours later, I sat alone in my study, her words echoing in my mind. Was I projecting? Had I allowed the cracks I saw in other people's lives to seep into my own? I glanced at her laptop, closed on the desk. The thoughts churned. If I was wrong, if she wasn't hiding anything, then all of this had been my own destruction. But if I was right, if she was lying to my face, I didn't think. I opened the laptop, fingers shaking as I navigated the files, each one a test of my restraint. And then, there it was, a hidden folder, buried under several subfolders, the title so benign that anyone else might have overlooked it. I clicked on it, the screen filling with documents, draft emails, notes, files, a plan laid out in sickening detail, written in her words, her phrases. And with every line, the truth came into focus. It was blackmail, patient records, emails, all confidential information, collected in a meticulous blueprint to dismantle my life. They'd planned it all, her and Gabriel, my patient's secrets, their lives, reduced to ammunition. Each file was a weapon, aimed at destroying everything I'd built, a slow dissection of my life from the inside out. My hands felt numb as I closed the laptop, the weight of the betrayal settling in. They weren't just tearing apart our marriage. This was a plot to ruin me entirely, to destroy my reputation, my practice, everything I'd worked for. And Mara, she was in on it from the beginning. I sat there, unable to move, the enormity of it all pressing down, filling the room until I could barely breathe. I'd built my career on trust, on the promise of confidentiality, and now, the people closest to me were poised to shatter it in one brutal, final blow. A part of me wanted to confront her, to storm into the room and demand an answer. But what would it change? She'd spin it, deflect it, and I'd be left worse off than before, all while Gabriel laughed in the background, knowing he'd outplayed me. No, this needed more than anger. It needed precision, the kind of clarity I'd once prided myself on. But sitting there, in the quiet of my study, all I felt was helplessness, the kind that stripped away any remaining illusion of control. They'd planned it perfectly, and now I was a step away from being ruined by my own trust, my own inability to see the truth when it was right in front of me. I stared at the closed laptop, my mind racing through options, each one a dead end. I could confront her, risk everything coming out in the open. Or I could try to play along, pretend I hadn't seen anything, hoping to gather enough proof to protect myself. In the silence, I realized I was cornered. Every move, every action was designed to work against me. They'd left me with no way out. And the worst part was knowing that, in some twisted way, I'd given them everything they needed to pull it off. I made sure Mara saw me at my breaking point. I'd slam a door on my way to the study, mutter to myself when I knew she was listening. I needed her to believe I was losing it, letting the weight of my suspicions push me to the edge. And the more I staged these small outbursts, the more confident she seemed, emboldened by what she saw as my unraveling. She grew careless, almost smug. Exactly what I wanted. Then, I set the trap. One evening I told Mara I wanted a settlement discussion. No confrontation, no melodrama. Just a quiet talk to resolve things amicably. I made sure the invitation reached Gabriel too, carefully worded to suggest I was willing to negotiate. From the tension in Mara's jaw when she accepted, I knew I had them where I wanted them. My apparent resignation lulled them in, convinced them that I was broken, defeated, and ready to surrender. The room settled into silence as Mara and Gabriel took their seats, each brimming with confidence. I folded my hands, watching them, feeling that dark calm as I let their arrogance fill the space between us. Gabriel was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice a low, smug drawl. Aaron, let's be realistic. This is an easy arrangement. You give us what we want and we walk away. You keep your reputation. Everybody wins. I tilted my head, my expression neutral. Is that what this is? An arrangement? Aaron, please. Mara's voice was smooth, practiced, almost patronizing. She'd perfected that tone over the years, but now it cut like glass. This is nothing personal, it's just necessary. Necessary, I repeated, tasting the word. You've built a solid practice, a nice life, Gabriel added, his grin wide and confident. It'd be a shame to see it dismantled. All that work, all those clients, we could see that reputation of yours crumble faster than you'd think. We have enough in those patient records alone to ruin you for good. I leaned back, giving him a cold smile. Patient records? Yes, Mara answered, leaning in with a casual air that made my stomach churn. Every confidential file, Patient X, Gabriel as you'd call him, has documented it all, Aaron. Patient history, private emails, sessions, everything. We don't want to expose it, of course, but it's up to you, Gabriel interrupted, flashing a quick grin. $500,000 and you leave Mara alone, permanently. We'll disappear and you keep everything intact. I nodded, letting his words sink in. $500,000? I murmured, quite the sum. And my silence, my departure from Mara's life, in exchange for what? Her loyalty? Mara's lips twisted into a small, mocking smile. Come on, Aaron. Loyalty? She shook her head, leaning forward, eyes sharp and unforgiving. It's not like we've encountered each other in that way, she added, with a dismissive wave toward Gabriel. But after this, after you sign the divorce and give me what I'm entitled to, half of everything you have, well, maybe I'll find that opportunity. Who knows? A nice villa somewhere abroad. I could use a change of scenery. The calm, calculated cruelty in her voice stung, but I kept my face blank. So, that's how you see this ending? She gave me a look that was equal parts pity and derision. We've been married for years, Aaron. Don't pretend it's still about vows or loyalty. It's about what we both deserve. I forced a short laugh, bitter but steady. Funny you'd bring up what you deserve, Mara. I wonder how much that $500,000 will cost you in the end. Gabriel's grin faltered, his fingers tapping on the arm of his chair. He cleared his throat, his tone sharpening. You don't have much room for negotiation here, Doc. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. I nodded, giving him a long look, noting the small twitch at the corner of his mouth. And why is that exactly? I'd think if you're this confident, you wouldn't need to rush things. Mara's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. Aaron, this is simple. We're giving you a chance to walk away. You've always been so good at reading people. So read the room. We have the upper hand. Take the settlement and go. Gabriel shifted, his confidence draining, a bead of sweat appearing at his temple. You know what's at stake. We've got the power to end you, Doc. And honestly, it'd be easier than you think. So why don't you just end me? I interrupted, keeping my voice cool. You really believe that, don't you? Gabriel faltered, glancing at Mara for support. She kept her expression steady, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Gabriel, she said, casting him a sideways look. This is just Aaron trying to bait us. Ignore it. But I wasn't done. No, please ignore me, I said, setting my elbows on the desk, leaning in. Let's pretend I'm not here for a moment, and maybe think about what happens if this all backfires. You've seen how quickly things can turn. One day you're calling the shots, and the next... Mara's jaw tightened, but Gabriel was unraveling. His fingers drummed faster, his breathing shallow as he met my gaze. What are you getting at? I reached into the drawer, pulling out the recording device and setting it down between us. This conversation, every word. I have a copy on file, and so do the authorities. They froze, Mara's face paling as she registered what I'd said. I leaned forward, voice low. I've known about your plans, Mara, every detail of your necessary scheme. The files you've been collecting, the recorded sessions, the emails, all of it is documented. And while you've been carefully planning to ruin my reputation, I've been gathering everything I need to see you and Gabriel behind bars. Gabriel shot out of his chair, his voice cracking. You're bluffing. I met his glare with a steady gaze, letting him see the truth in my eyes. Am I? I have files. Confidential information that only the two of you could have accessed. This entire scheme is in police hands as we speak. Mara shook her head, struggling to keep her composure. Aaron, you don't have to do this. I don't have to do anything, Mara, I replied, my tone cutting. But you'll have to face the consequences. You wanted to destroy me, my life, my career, but now you get to watch your plans fall apart, one betrayal at a time. Mara's calm shattered, and she reached across the table, desperation edging her voice. Aaron, don't. Think about it. We don't have to end like this. I pulled out a folder and set it before her. This isn't an ending, Mara. This is a beginning. I opened the folder to reveal the divorce papers. This marriage is over, and you get nothing from me. No settlement, no villa, no $500,000. Gabriel slumped back in his chair, his mouth working soundlessly as his hands fidgeted. You can't do this, I smiled, letting the weight of my victory sink in. It's already done. The police have everything, your emails, your threats, the recordings, and all the evidence they need, so you're right. We don't have to end things here. I'll leave the rest to the authorities. A knock sounded on the door, and Mara's face twisted in horror as two officers entered, their expressions blank as they approached Gabriel and Mara. The handcuffs clicked, securing Gabriel's wrists, his previous arrogance crumbling as he looked from the officers to me, desperation filling his eyes. Aaron, we don't have to. It's over, I said, my tone final. You thought you had the power, but you forgot one thing. I never leave things half-finished. The evening breeze was soft as it swept across the hills of Galicia, carrying the faint scent of salt from the distant coast. I leaned back in the chair on my terrace, overlooking the green, rolling hills stretching out before me, the countryside untouched and endless. The villa, a modest but beautiful place I'd purchased on impulse, was my sanctuary now. A few months ago, I wouldn't have imagined myself here, but circumstances have a way of realigning priorities. And if there was ever a time to walk away from everything, this was it. Mara and Gabriel's downfall had been thorough and absolute. They were both behind bars now, their schemes and crimes laid bare in a courtroom that buzzed with the ugly details. Mara, who'd once been my partner, my confidant, had stood in shackles, her composed face blank as the evidence was read aloud. I'd felt a pang watching her there, realizing the depth of her betrayal and the person she'd become. Or maybe she'd always been that person, and I'd been too close, too trusting to see it. She wanted my money, my reputation, everything I'd spent my life building. That part still stung. I'd loved her once, deeply, and in the darkest moments of the trial, I'd catch glimpses of that love, the old memories tainted but not erased. In some ways, that was the hardest part, reconciling the person I'd loved with the stranger who'd tried to ruin me. Gabriel, of course, had been every bit the remorseless villain he'd always hinted at. It was ironic in a way. His biggest flaw had been his overconfidence. He'd never imagined that I'd get the upper hand. But by the end, he was out of his depth, just another con who'd been too smart for his own good. Now, he was paying the price, his charm and cunning powerless behind the prison walls. As for Lisa, well, that had been more disappointing than anything. When I'd learned she'd been sharing details about our sessions, I'd known that I couldn't overlook it. Confidentiality was everything in my line of work, and her breach could have jeopardized far more than my trust. Even though her words had tipped me off, had helped me see through Mara's deception, I couldn't let it go. She was dismissed the same day we spoke. She hadn't fought it. She knew better, I think, and perhaps in her own way, she understood that it was the right thing for both of us. In the stillness of the Spanish countryside, away from clients, away from the heavy burdens of secrecy and trust, I could breathe again. Each sunrise felt like a clean slate, each sunset a reminder that, in the end, I'd come out whole. I wasn't the same man who'd walked into that twisted scheme my wife and patient ex had woven, but maybe that was for the best. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button for more of Love, Lust, Lies.